Howdy folks, and welcome back to Inland Urbanist. Today we're going to interrupt your regularly unscheduled programming to bring this special report. By now you have undoubtedly seen the title of this video and know that the subject is the California High-Speed Rail project. However, although I have had a rough script for a video about California High-Speed Rail sitting around for well over a year and would give it mild attention every couple of weeks, I literally have another video that I already had recorded and edited down the audio for that I had planned to release before this video, as well as another one that I had wanted to re-record and several other scripts that were farther along. Nevertheless, the situation seems timely enough to warrant this out-of-order submission. But what exactly is that situation? Before directly answering that question, it is perhaps time for some history. The video that Banks Rail released earlier this year said a lot of what I have been considering regarding history, so this certainly won't be a 2-hour episode. At the same time, there are some points which I would like to either underscore or which were not quite addressed in that video, or the videos of others like Lucid Stew or Ampere Beep, so this will be a bit longer than 5 minutes. With that being said, where to begin? Or perhaps the central question is not where to begin, but where does it begin? The concept of high-speed rail in California has been talked about since at least the 1960s, and by the 1970s, Jerry Brown was batting it around during his first set of 2 terms from 1975 to 1983. The son of former Governor Pat Brown, who is often referred to as the architect of modern California for his legacy projects such as the California Aqueduct, Jerry also was interested in a signature project of his own. Thus, as he came into office, his pick to be the head of Caltrans pushed for a study into the concept, which manifested as various reports on the feasibility. This ultimately led to the passage of Assembly Bill 3647 by Assemblymember Young in 1982, which Governor Brown signed into law in October of that year. Under AB 3647, the state would be able to issue up to $1.25 billion in tax-exempt bonds for the construction of a quote-unquote Shinkansen-type bullet train from downtown LA to San Diego, along with a quote-unquote 17-mile leg between downtown Los Angeles and the Los Angeles International Airport. The work was to be led by the American High-Speed Rail Corporation, which, per a piece by Richard Trainer, was a front company formed by 2 Amtrak employees to work with Ryoichi Sasakawa, a perhaps questionable Japanese billionaire, and the Japanese government to advance the concept. Total costs were estimated in the neighborhood of $2.9 billion, or what's a little over $9.7 billion today after inflation, for what was planned as a 125-mile-per-hour railroad, with it being promised that the Japanese would cover up to 25% of the costs. Where have I heard this before? The hope was that this service would be able to begin in 1988, with an express train making the trip in as little as just 59 minutes. Needless to say, that never came to pass. While the initial work of the AHRC was to commission an Arthur D. Little study on the concept, there were quickly doubters asking whether the ridership projections released in the study were realistic, and whether it would be able to operate at a profit and repay the bonds. On top of that, it faced another headwind, that of local governments concerned about the impacts the project would have on their communities. In what many today would probably consider to be a promising move that they wish would have been repeated, AB 3647 exempted the project from CEQA. However, that didn't tamp down the opposition, which in combination with other issues ultimately killed the project. And it also probably died in no small part because Jerry Brown was out of office in January of 1983. Things were a bit quieter on the high-speed rail front in California for about a decade after that, but it certainly was not forgotten. In 1992, the FRA designated a, quote, California corridor linking San Diego and Los Angeles with the Bay Area and Sacramento via the San Joaquin Valley, as was directed by the Ice-T legislation. That same year, California voters narrowly rejected Proposition 156, the Passenger Rail and Clean Air Bond Act of 1992, by a 51.9 to 48.1 margin, which would have authorized $1 billion in public funds for rail projects around the state, and was a follow-on to Prop 108, the Passenger Rail and Clean Air Bond Act of 1990, which voters did approve. That bond had authorized $1 billion for intercity and commuter rail around the state, and is where money to start systems like Metrolink came from, and also facilitated the buyout of various rail rights-of-way around the inland region and state. Nevertheless, the legislature passed Senate Concurrent Resolution 6 by Senator Culp in 1993, which created the California Intercity High-Speed Rail Commission, an entity tasked with developing an intercity rail plan for the state that could be implemented between 2000 and 2020. The next year, the University of California Transportation Center at UC Berkeley published a report on what it would take to upgrade 10 intercity corridors around the state to both 110 mile per hour and some up to 125 mile per hour service speeds, potentially with tilt train technology. All this work and more led to the creation of the actual California High-Speed Rail Authority in 1996, Once again, Senator Culp authored the legislation, this time Senate Bill 1420, with the goal of further developing the concepts produced by the Commission into something that workable that would be able to provide the real blueprint for a real project. SB 1420 also specified that the authority would be disbanded at the end of 2000 absent forward movement on the project, and thus express permission to continue from the governor, legislator, and voters. It seems safe to say that they did indeed get that permission, and by 2002 that authority was made a permanent fixture. As the third millennia of the Common Era dawned, the authority was hard at work proving that they should exist. This involved conducting studies that were directed by the enabling legislation, building on the work earlier in the 1990s to nail down specifics of the corridors that had been delineated in those prior times. By 2002, it was believed that things were ready for a prime time, and the legislature passed SB 1856 by Costa, the Safe, Reliable, High-Speed Passenger Train Bond Act for the 21st century, which was subsequently signed into law by Governor Gray Davis. It authorized the state to provide $9.95 billion in bond funds to start construction on the 700-mile high-speed rail system, with $9 billion being for the LA to SF segment, and the other $950 million being for connecting services, planning, and environmental. As we know now, there was no high-speed rail proposition on the ballot in 2004. Rather, it came in 2008. So what happened? The first sign of trouble came early in 2003. Although Gray Davis's website touts his signing of SB 1856 as one of his key transportation accomplishments as governor, there was trouble in the air. Facing a sudden onset of budget deficit, how does this sound familiar? When Governor Davis released his budget proposal in January 2003, it took a swipe at basically everything the state funded, potentially reducing expenditures to quote-unquote pre-1999 levels. That included a proposal to eliminate the High-Speed Rail Authority as a separate agency and instead collapse it into Caltrans. In response, Senator Flores authored SB 91 to preserve the independence of the authority. As the year dragged on, SB 91 ended up not moving, and the legislature managed to pass a budget which did not eliminate the separate high-speed rail authority, and Governor Davis signed it into law prior to the June 30 deadline. However, in hindsight, his signature on that budget was also his political death warrant. While he had just won re-election in 2002, a recall petition had been filed against Governor Davis in March of 2003, and for many voters, the budget was the last straw as it included some tax increases, specifically an increase in the vehicle license fee. Before the ink could even dry on the budget, the Secretary of State confirmed that more than enough valid signatures had been submitted for a recall, and the rest, as they say, became history. And perhaps a bit of foreshadowing, October 7, 2003 was the day that Governor Davis's political world came crashing down, as more than 55% of Californians who bothered to show up to vote in the recall election approved the recall and elected in his place the Austrian-born actor Arnold Schwarzenegger to terminate the vehicle license fee increase which had been enacted in the budget that Gray Davis had signed earlier in the year. But not content with his success in that arena, the governor quickly turned his sights to the fast-approaching bond vote, which was scheduled for 2004. Unsurprisingly, nixing a revenue generator did not fix a budget deficit, so with the fiscal constraints continuing to face the state, Governor Schwarzenegger pushed the legislature to punt on the bond measure from 2004 to 2006, a cycle which ended up repeating itself as it was once again punted from 2006 to 2008. Nevertheless, despite the delay in submitting the ballot measure for approval, the authority was getting some money from the state budget during this time. This funding was used to pay for ongoing early planning and environmental work, as unlike in the AHRC days, the legislature did not exempt the state project from CEQA. Thus, during this time, the authority produced a programmatic EIR for the entire system in 2005, and then a more detailed one for the Bay Area to the Central Valley in 2008, just prior to the vote. At the same time, the authority was not able to truly meet the need of what it should have been doing, as although Governor Schwarzenegger was not proposing to completely collapse it into Caltrans, he was only proposing funding for the authority that would basically just keep the lights on. Though the legislature was apt to ignore him and give them more money, it was still nowhere near enough of what they really needed. From our vantage point in the future, that was certainly a foolhardy move, as they were trying to fund stuff at that time that continues to bedevil the authority to this day, namely more advanced design and right-of-way acquisition or preservation. As 2008 approached, there was uncertainty over whether the governor would try to force the high-speed rail bond off the ballot by loading up the state borrowing capacity with bonds for more roads and other infrastructure, such as Prop 1B, which had passed in 2006 and already approved $20 billion for roads and other similar projects. But not everything else materialized, and as enabled by AB 3034 by Assemblymember Galgiani, the Safe, reliable, high-speed passenger train bond act for the 21st century finally went before the voters where it passed. But what exactly passed? For that, it is helpful to take a look at the different versions of enabling legislation through the years. As noted above, AB 1856 was the first bill which was approved by Governor Davis for votes that was to be held in 2004. In that bill, the main, i.e. Phase 1 corridor, was defined as San Francisco Transbay to LA Union Station, with additional corridors of Oakland to San Jose, Sacramento Merced, LA to the IE to San Diego, and LA to Irvine. While the legislation to punt to first 2006 and 2008 did not define corridors, AB 3034, which actually put the measure on the ballot, did. Once again, the primary route was from San Francisco Transbay to Union Station, but to Anaheim was also appended there. Furthermore, it added some secondary corridors. Or maybe it's fairer to say there were more concrete definition to the Phase 1 corridor than is to say that they were necessarily expected to be to entirely separate corridors. Thus, in addition to Oakland to San Jose, the named corridors in AB 3034 were Sacramento to Stockton to Fresno, San Francisco Transbay to San Jose to Fresno, Fresno to Bakersfield to Palmdale to LA Union Station to Riverside to San Diego, LA Union Station to Anaheim to Irvine, and Merced to Stockton to Oakland via Altamont. Additionally, there were time constraints placed on the operations. For the 2004 vote, they included 2 hours 42 minutes for LA Union Station to San Francisco Transbay or Oakland. San Francisco Transbay to San Jose was 31 minutes. San Jose to LA at 2 hours 14 minutes. San Diego to LA at a 1 hour flat. IE to LA at 29 minutes. Sacramento to LA Union Station at 2 hours and 22 minutes. And Sacramento to San Jose at 1 hour 12 minutes. By 2008, those numbers have been refined, with 2 minutes being shaved off the LA to San Francisco or Oakland and Sacramento times for 2 hours and 40 minutes to either San Francisco or Oakland, or 2 hours 20 minutes for LA to Sacramento. A minute was shaved off the San Francisco to San Jose time, and 4 minutes off the San Jose to LA time, while the IE to LA time increased by a minute, and LA to San Diego jumped up by 20 minutes. Now, perhaps dating myself a little, on November 4, 2008, I and several million other California voters eagerly cast our ballots for Prop 1A, authorizing the sale of bonds to begin construction on the project. Finally, the authority had received the infusion of cash which they needed to get the project rolling. Except that is not what really happened. Again, others have covered this situation more extensively, but the short of the situation is that what passed in 2008 were not much more than lines on a map, with the final environmental clearance for the Bay to Central Valley concept not coming until 2010. On top of that, there were a litany of lawsuits challenging the validity of various aspects of the plan, whether the state had the authority to build it, whether the legislature had the authority to modify components of the ballot measure, and much more. All of that added precious time to the work. But now let's check in on the money side of things. First, taking a swing by the HRC project from the early 1980s, that was estimated at $2.9 billion for LA to San Diego for up to 125 mile per hour service, which means it would be broadly equivalent to what we now have in Brightling, Florida. However, in the 1994 study from the UC Berkeley, their estimate for the 125 mile per hour LA to San Diego service was $2.66 billion, actually down approximately $300 million from that earlier estimate. Meanwhile, the same study put the LA to Bay Area via the Central Valley at $8.75 billion for upgrading the existing route 225 mile per hour service, or $9.6 billion for building a new 200 mile per hour route through the Central Valley. However, another UC Berkeley study put out that same year was already showing a range of $8.1 billion to $11.5 billion for LA to San Francisco, and that was in 1991 dollars. The study came out in 1994. In 2000, the authority released its first business plan as required by the enabling legislation. By that point, the estimated cost had already grown to the $20 billion range, but that was for the entire quote-unquote system. So while it was basically double what was estimated from the earlier studies in 1994, though it's worth noting that those studies were not done by the authority, it is also covering more than just LA to San Francisco. In fact, that earlier study had about $16.4 billion for LA to San Francisco, plus Sacramento, plus LA to San Diego, and San Jose to Sacramento. Yet, the future was only look up. In 2004, the authority released its draft programmatic EIR for the system, and in it, they had yet another new estimate for the system. $37 billion, close to almost doubling again. Then, by the time the vote came around in 2008, the cost presented in the ballot measure text was up to $45 billion for the entire system. Yet, immediately after the vote, the authority released a 2008 business plan, which estimated the cost of LA to Anaheim at $33 billion in total, including $23.5 billion for actual construction, and the rest as soft costs, such as design, engineering, right-of-way, and the cost of rolling stock. From now on, we will also refer to LA to Anaheim as Phase 1, which is a subset of the full system. In 2012, the authority released another business plan, pegging the cost of the IOS at $31 billion and the entirety of Phase 1 at $68 billion. a substantial increase from earlier estimates, as that figure was about triple the amount for Phase 1 as was provided in the 2008 business plan, and even surpassing the amount for the entire system that was presented in the ballot language. With such a big delta, the authority felt compelled to also include an entire report on why the costs were so much higher than the last business plan. The 2014 business plan kept the same number but referenced work by the Congressional Government Accountability Office to validate it. In 2016, the business plan showed a decrease in the total Phase 1 costs, back down to $64 billion. This was attributed to a significant milestone that had been achieved since the 2014 plan, the start of actual construction. The year prior, Governor Jerry Brown had joined construction workers, board members, and other dignitaries to officially break ground on the project. Although the work was quickly stalled for months due to ongoing lawsuits, the authority used the construction packages as the basis for reducing the projected costs. However, that good fortune was short-lived. By the time the 2018 business plan came around, the cost estimate had returned to the upward trajectory, clocking in at around $77 billion for all of Phase 1. 3 years later, the 2020 business plan had increased once again, this time more clearly showing the estimate as a range, from $63 billion on the low end to $98 billion on the high end, with a quote-unquote base of $80 billion. A year later, the 2022 business plan once again showed a range of $77 billion to $113 billion, and now pegging a quote-unquote best estimate at $93 to $94 billion. 2024's business plan continued the trend with a new range of $89 billion to $128 billion, with the base finally eclipsing the $100 billion mark to settle at $106 billion. That brings us to one of the two major impetuses for producing this video at this precise moment, the Project Update Report. On August 22 of this year, 2025, the authority released what they titled a Supplemental Project Update Report, as it was an update to the Project Update Report which was released earlier in the year. But many in the interested camp have quickly taken it to simply calling it a PUR, and that is what will be done in this video as well. In the PUR, the costs are now estimated at $90.9 billion for a new subset of Phase 1 described as San Francisco to Gilroy to Palmdale, including Merced. Notably, while the figure is lower, it lacks the final segment into LA Union Station and to Anaheim. While not presented in the PUR document, the 2024 business plan puts them at between $17.3 billion on the low end and $31.2 billion on the high end, with a base of $22.7 billion, which when added to the PUR figures brings us right back to the ballpark of the figure from the business plan document, and that's based on the low estimate. The PUR makes it clear that a key goal is that the authority is seeking to slim down the project in search of delivering as much of the project as early as possible. One of the major reasons for that is certainly because the project is decades behind schedule. As noted earlier, AHRC had hoped to be in service in 1988. In the 1990s, the studies were forecasting service to be available by 2010. In 2008, the vote around Prop 1A had hoped to have Phase 1 complete by 2020 and the entire system by 2030. Now, as of the most recent business plan, the hope was that the IOS would be complete by 2033. To say that the schedule has slipped would be an understatement. At the same time, I believe it's worth taking a moment to more holistically consider the situation. We have just looked at the cost, but now it's time to look at the funding side of things. As noted above, the AHRC was a proposal to be funded by the Japanese government, state-exempt tax bonds, and Japanese business. After that fell apart, the studies in the 1990s focused on presenting the plan, but were predicated on or expecting private companies would be the ones to build and operate. When the authority was created, it was tasked with something similar, and its initial business plan was supposed to include all foreseen funding avenues. By 2002, the legislature had gotten on board with the state providing at least some of the funding, as it was the year they initially authorized a ballot measure for bond funding. That carried over to 2008 when voters finally approved those bonds. However, as seen above, the cost estimates quickly climbed after that point, and the state was eager to fill the gap with anything but bond funds. While there had been prior questions of where Governor Schwarzenegger stood on the project due to comments during his campaign, during the recall, as well as his actions to delay the vote, he was one of the supporters of Prop 1A, and it's probably why the CIGLP was not opposed at that time. Nevertheless, it was quickly clear that Prop 1A was not going to be close to enough to cover the full cost. On the same ballot that California voters passed Prop 1A, they voted to ban gay marriage, and they and most others around the country also chose a skinny little kid with a funny name to be their next president. On January 20, 2009, Barack Hussein Obama stood before the largest crowd to ever attend an event in D.C. and took the oath of office to be the 44th president. Running on a campaign of hope, Obama had promised a new path forward and a response to the financial crisis that was gripping the nation. Having been elected as a sitting senator and picking another sitting senator to be his vice president, Obama prodded Congress into passing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act within a month of his inauguration, which he promptly signed into law. The ARRA included $8 billion for high-speed rail projects around the country on a competitive basis. Although California wasn't the only high-speed rail project underway at the time, it was the most ambitious, which ultimately ended up in the authority winning $3.5 billion. But this came with a string attached. Start in the Central Valley. As noted above, by 2012, the cost estimate had increased to $68 billion, including $31 billion for the Central Valley IOS alone. So although the infusion from the feds was helpful, it was clearly not enough. Beyond that, it had been expected that, quote-unquote, private investment would be a considerable player, but to that date, and indeed even to the present, that was not the case. However, something had happened in 2010. Jerry Brown was reelected to an unprecedented third term as governor, an event which the proponents of Prop 140 surely had not foreseen in 1990, as they forgot to note that it would apply to people who had already served 2 terms, not just 2 terms going forward from that time. Unsurprisingly, Governor Brown was excited that what was a mere vision in his first set of 2 terms was now actually underway and was a very strong and vocal supporter of the project. Meanwhile, in 2008, the legislature had passed AB 32 by Pavley. This directed the reduction of emissions in the state, and while it did not dictate the creation of it, the law authorized the California Air Resources Board to explore options, including a cap-and-trade program. While some advocated for other approaches to be used to lower emissions due to the concerns that cap-and-trade could not adequately reduce emissions for those who were often facing the highest pollution burdens, CARB ultimately settled on that approach after all, with the first auction coming in November of 2012. For the first year or so, the money was somewhat vaguely directed to merely funding priorities recognized in a scoping plan, which AB 32 had mandated the development of, and of course this money was also quote-unquote borrowed by the legislature to backfill the general fund. But by the middle of 2014, the legislature decided to more concretely define where the money would flow. Here, Governor Brown was influential in convincing the legislature to dedicate 25% of its funds in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to the authority. However, AB 32 had only specified through 2020, so as the decade wore on, there were questions about the future of the program. These questions culminated with the passage of AB 398 by Assemblymember Garcia in 2017, where once again Governor Brown ensured that the legislature continued the 25% appropriation to the authority. In 2018, California voters rejected Prop 70, which would have required that the legislature reconsider the GGRF allocation of AB 398 in 2024. This proposition was a compromise to gain Republican support for AB 398, as a bunch of Democrats wanted to not vote for it, but because it was perceived to need a 2/3 majority to pass, in case it was ultimately ruled a tax, Governor Brown and the legislative leaders worked out a deal to get several Republicans to vote for it so that it could still get the supermajority. Although this was the official reason, a number of interests also saw it as an opportunity to hopefully defund the high-speed rail project in the future, because it was hoped that the legislative composition in 2024 would not be willing to continue the appropriation for the project. However, with the 2030 horizon fast approaching, the legislature has decided that actually they will consider allocations in this year, 2025, only a year after they would have been forced to have Prop 70 pass. California's legislative season might seem like a very drawn-out process as compared to other states, but it does eventually come to an end. This year, the last day of the regular session for both chambers is September 12th, and the last day to amend any bill is a week earlier, on the 5th. This rush comes as the legislature has returned from its summer recess on the 19th of August. With that introduction out of the way, we can finally address the real meat of what has brought the urgency to making this video right now. As noted, we are on the home stretch of the legislative calendar, with limited time to get bills amended and passed. However, the legislature and Governor Newsom have decided they are serious about renewing cap and trade, or cap and invest, this year, yet a deal has not yet been finalized. As such, various interests of all stripes continue to pitch their proposal for all aspects of the situation, including how GGRF money should be spent. One such proposal is the recent push which dropped on the 26th, a few days after the PUR was released. Send $3.3 billion a year from the GGRF to LA County Transit and no one gets hurt. Or we will agree to continue $1 billion a year to the High-Speed Rail Authority as requested by Newsom. This certainly sounds absurd on its face, but it does warrant some discussion. First, the GGRF has a purpose, and it is to reduce emissions, not just to build the high-speed rail project. From that vantage point, there is perhaps some validity to putting money into local transit, as it certainly can be useful for reducing emissions. At the same time, among other reasons, the question must be asked if it would be reducing more than other opportunities, especially since that level of funding would eat up pretty much the entirety of GGRF monies. While transportation is the biggest source of emissions in the state, the jury might still be out on whether putting all the money into transit into LA County is truly the right move. On top of that, it is the next episode of a familiar saga, that of LA County electeds to Sacramento trying to use high-speed rail funding as leverage to get money for transit in LA County, as Assemblymember Friedman and Speaker Rendon tried a similar stunt a few years ago when Newsom was trying to get the last of the Prop 1A bonds sold. To understand why that is, perhaps it is finally time to talk about something which might have seemed suspiciously absent until now: the route. If you want to start a fight, just venture to express an opinion on the route that California high-speed rail should take, and you will be sure to draw out a chorus of dissenters in either direction. Which way should the fast train go is a question far older than the high-speed rail project that is currently underway. As discussed earlier, the first foray by the state was an attempt to upgrade the LA to San Diego corridor. After that fell apart, study on the concept continued. A study authorized by Senate Concurrent Resolution 6 by COP looked at a multitude of corridors and options for getting from LA to San Francisco. Part of the California High-Speed Rail series of studies, it built on an earlier work by the same author and took a detailed look at several options, namely 110 and 125 mile-per-hour upgrades to existing routes, as well as entirely new alignments for either the Central Valley or the coast built for up to 250. It also looked at a couple of other corridors beyond just LA to San Francisco, but we're only going to focus on the 6 LA to San Francisco options here. Out of that study, though, the cost estimates were similar at $9.5 billion for a new alignment in the Central Valley versus $9.2 billion for a new alignment on the coast. The travel times were significantly better for the Central Valley option, and it would serve more people. Thus, it is not surprising that it was ultimately chosen as the preferred route. But even within the Central Valley, there are a menu of routing options. The chief ones are which pass to use to get into the Central Valley at either end, and whether the route in the valley should follow I-5 or actually serve the population centers. Though the debate still rages to this day, the routing assumed in the 1994 study looks remarkably familiar. But getting from that map to the map we have today of construction is not a straight line, as there remain several who advocate for other routing options instead. Two choices in particular, that of using Tehachapi Pass versus the Grapevine, and using a chosen alignment west of but proximate to Central Valley cities versus I-5 are given fairly detailed explanations. For Tehachapi, the reasoning was that it provided better gradient options that would connect to the high desert population, while I-5 was discarded because it would not reasonably serve Central Valley cities. The time delta for both was calculated to be an additional 6 and 5 minutes respectively, for a total of 11 minutes. By the time the legislature got around to putting together ballot measures, the key alignment was chosen, or in other words, via the Central Valley. But there were still questions about especially the passes. As reviewed earlier, the first attempt at going to the ballot that was passed in 2002 was not extremely prescriptive in that regard. However, by the time 2008 came around, that version had more concretely defined corridors, which, when considered as a whole, line up to connect what is most of the current project as mapped. Nevertheless, a favorite hobby horse of many is to latch onto the early attempt to have the French National Rail Company, SNCF, assist the authority on the project, and which ultimately ended, but not before SNCF had suggested that they use I-5 and the Grapevine, putting the Central Valley cities on the spurs. Of course, that could not work with the ballot measure, as it also included a requirement that each corridor be served without transfers, undoubtedly put in there with the express intent of avoiding being stuck on spurs. But what does this have to do with the price of eggs? On their website, the authority has a number of maps of the project. One in particular sticks out. It's a map of the entire California high-speed rail system, so phase 1 and 2, overlaid on a population map of the state. It obviously shows that the train will serve the population centers, but looking at this map, the motivation of LA County electeds to attempt to sabotage the project begins to come into view. Though the population as a whole hovers in the 40 million range, and we could perhaps support 10 times that much if we really tried, but I digress. We'll talk about housing another time. As is evident by that map, it is not evenly distributed at all. Instead, there are population pockets strewn about the system, which will eventually do a decent job of connecting it all together. However, the density is more clearly clustered in SoCal, and LA County alone has about 10 million residents, netting 25% of the entire state population. Furthermore, the population midpoint for the state, or in other words, the line where half the state lives north and half lives south, is about at Burbank Airport, or the 210, or State Route 134, depending on where you are. Thus, from the perspective of the LA County delegation, high-speed rail has not really served LA County at all, and they don't see that it will, at least until it gets to Palmdale. Though even then, none of the project will really be in the southern half of the state population-wise until the segments south of Burbank. As elected representatives, it perhaps makes sense that they would like to see more benefits from a program going into the county that accounts for a full quarter of the state population. However, they are misguided. As noted above, the letter from the delegation came 4 days after the release of the PUR. While 4 days is maybe not a lot of time for us mere mortals, it certainly is enough for their staffers to have thumbed through it a couple of times, so they should have had a more informed ask in their letter. That they didn't shows other problems. The first problem which the letter lays bare is that there's a lack of awareness or vision about what is truly needed for transit in SoCal more generally, as well as unfamiliarity with the project. On the ballot with Prop 1A was a local measure for LA County residents to tax themselves to accelerate transportation projects, known as Measure R. It went on to pass and kicked off a building spree of light rail, heavy rail, better bus service, and yes, even more freeways. It was augmented 8 years later with Measure M, which functioned to double that transportation tax and also ended a 30-year sunset of R. Although, if you want to really be technical, it doesn't actually sunset R, but rather, after R sunsets in 30 years from that time, M will double and absorb that same amount into perpetuity or until the heat death of the universe, whichever comes first. Since that time, many projects have opened, more are actively under construction, and even more are edging their way to a groundbreaking ceremony. Undoubtedly, injecting $3.3 billion a year into that would not hurt and could accelerate a number of projects and help backfill any fiscal cliffs that might be lurking in the background. However, that letter doesn't specify what projects the transit money should go to, just vague transit reference. There's a lot to add to do with little detail. We're usually talking about a north of $33 billion over a decade, or just about double what the authority has actually spent to date. Now, there are certainly could be some worthy contenders for that money. As noted earlier, it is not unreasonable to fund transit as a part of a strategy to reduce emissions, and in fact, as covered last year on this channel, 2022 CARB Scoping Plan has a goal of reducing VMT 30% by 2030, which the Sky region is not even going to pretend to come anywhere close to meeting. This money wouldn't completely solve that problem, but it certainly could grease the skids on projects that will be pretty impactful, such as the support for the past transit project, extending C line to Norwalk, Lake Union Station, or the K line extensions, and potentially even allowing some of them to be completed decades earlier than originally envisioned in the current plans. There are also projects involving Metrolink that would directly support high-speed rail, as it will be sharing the corridor from Burbank to LA Union Station, then on to Anaheim. But they've asked for none of that specifically. Also troubling is that was a letter from only the LA County delegation. Did they not reach out to the neighboring delegations? I know that an IE delegation exists, and I presume that the same is true from other regions of SoCal, more broadly. Anyway, while Imperial, LA, and Santa Barbara were the only SoCal counties to vote for Prop 1A way back in 2008, all except Ventura do have their own transportation sales taxes, as well as a long list of underfunded transit projects. Though they did allude to the struggles of their neighbors here in the inland region who must endure expensive car-based commutes, their asks are vague. Is it transit they want to fund stuff like the IE Rail Vision presented earlier on this channel? Is it the SCORE program for Metrolink? Is it money for Octa, for Omnitrans, for RTA, Foothill Transit, etc.? That then brings us back to the authority. The PUR was presented as an opportunity for a pivot to something that can quote-unquote deliver San Francisco to Palmdale by 2039, by in essence dropping Merced until later. This also shows why we didn't put the Central Valley cities on spurs, because we all know that we would gotten to the point of like, oops, we don't have the money, and you guys will have to wait. This will be accomplished by focusing on finishing current construction. Then, instead of going to Merced on the north, they would go to Gilroy first, where the high-speed rail trains could then run on Caltrain all the way to San Francisco, while south from the current construction, they would go to Bakersfield, then through Tehachapi to Palmdale. Recent graphics from the authority have also included the High Desert Corridor, to reference a quote-unquote Southwest high-speed rail network by connecting with Brightline West. The goal for all of this appears to be to provide an answer to the age-old question of when it would be actually possible to take a train from San Francisco or LA to the other, by offering what could be at most a one-transfer ride between the two cities. But is that enough? While I believe the delegation is misguided, there is a kernel of opportunity here, as I myself have long realized that the authority is likely going to have to shift some focus southward in the very near future to be able to get commitment for funding to continue, because that's just how politics works. In light of the ask from the LA County delegation, one might wonder what else could the authority or should the authority offer to get them on board. But also the question is the authority even really the one in the position to be making offers? This is a tacit assumption that they are, but really it will come out of the legislator, not the authority. Taking a look at the situation as a whole, I think the biggest and most impactful commitments could be made are as follows. First, they need to finish the environmental for LA Union Station to Anaheim ASAP, and they should also consider environmental down to Irvine. I know this is in the works, but still getting it done will send a signal of the commitment to SoCal. But crucially, once they finish Union Station to Anaheim, they are not done. At that point, all of Phase 1 will be cleared, but Phase 2 still remains. They should begin environmental work on Phase 2 immediately upon completion of the last bit of Phase 1 clearance, because the portion to San Diego passes by us here in the inland region, and some decisions which will potentially be quite expensive to undo in the future keep getting made out here. Beyond their environmental work, they need to advanced design on all the segments around the state, regardless of what phase. This is one of the shortcomings from a decade ago. At that time, when they awarded those design-build contracts, they ended up causing problems as the bidders had decided they would make different assumptions about what they would design and build than the authority had when they did their preliminary engineering, which resulted in the bids looking great because the bidders thought they could redesign some of the structures, but then they realized the authority actually knew what they were doing the first time around and had to come back with a hat in hand saying, hey, we need more money to be able to build what we have to build because we screwed up on the design. Ideally, a design build should force those bidders to eat that loss on their own, but the authorities end up paying out a lot of money for change orders due to that. Anyway, the authority has learned their lesson, is now doing design bid build, so it really behooves them to get all the design done. Additionally, what else they could do is pitch in on some electrification of Metrolink. There's another video on this topic brewing in the background, so make sure to hit the subscribe button. But the short of it is that with some lines already being agency owned, it should be possible to at least start with those. At minimum, we're talking about the Antelope Valley line, the San Bernardino line, a Ventura County line to at least Moorpark. It's all being pretty viable candidates right now, and that can be expanded in the future. And there are also other projects on the Los Angeles APA plan on a core score that are plenty worthy of consideration. And if we want to even consider, of course, this LA County delegation letter, but there are projects in San Diego County and out to Imperial as well. And to be clear, when saying they should pitch in, it doesn't have to be from the authority itself. As it stands, the delegation is asking for money directly from the GGRF to transit, not to be routed through the authority first, which is fine. Unless the authority is leading the projects, they do not need to burden themselves with that extra responsibility of doling out the money for projects. At the same time, this should unlock way more than $1 billion a year for the authority. One of the persistent claims about the project is that in addition to being way over budget, it's also long overdue. However, it should be quite evident that if the project is going to cost $100 billion and we only put in $1 billion a year, then it's going to take 100 years to get it built. So if we want to build faster, we need to put more money in. Thus, if anything, the delegation's ask should be flipped. $3.3 billion a year to the authority, $1 billion annually to SoCal Transit, and with a more defined endpoint for where that money will be going in SoCal, because if we're honest, some projects could be fine with not getting built. With the program reauthorized through 2045, that would provide up to $66 billion to the authority, which if combined with any federal funds that managed to survive the Trump administration's attempt to steal them, as well as any private investment that materializes, would likely pay for almost all of phase 1. Even a lower amount, say $2.5 billion a year, would still do wonders in getting the project moving faster and would better enable what should also be evident, that multiple portions of the project can be built at the same time. The current construction is of the iOS, but that's because that's the only money they had available. I believe if they had more money available, they would have worked on more sections. It would be entirely possible to work on the Gilroy tunnels, the Tehachapi tunnels, the tunnels in the SoCal, Burbank to Union Station to Anaheim, Gilroy to San Jose, and Madera to Merced all at once if they had that much money. This is the approach that the PR is basically advocating, that, give us all the money up front and we will build more sections at the same time and start service sooner, so get more sections working. Finally, there's additional potential untapped source of funding. PR references to attempting to get private investment via selling power to AI data centers and letting them use like the conduit for fiber and stuff like that. But I think there's real opportunity for freight, especially once phase 2 is connected. With the world's largest concentration of warehouses, we here in the inland region are no strangers to the gray boxes and all that they bring. At the same time, with the continued expansion of faster and faster e-commerce delivery service, I can see an opportunity for running package delivery into the bigger urban areas via high-speed rail by just chucking a couple satchels of packages onto a train. That could either be in dedicated trains or maybe just a car or two on regular trains that has a couple of seats cordoned off. Just like in aviation where they belly cargo often pays for the cheap seats, cargo delivery may well be able to keep high-speed rail on good terms with the treasurer. Last of all, one option which I have not really seen discussed anywhere is to run another ballot measure. It probably is ideal to at least wait until trains are running, so perhaps 2036 might be the earliest date to try to schedule it for. But it could be a good option to keep on the table, and it could also provide an opportunity to clear some things in Prop 1A, which in hindsight are mildly problematic. With Prop 1A having been passed in 2008, we're soon going to start coming up on the maturity date of some of the first bonds that were issued that it had authorized, open up space for new ones. It could be good if they could get a good $20 billion or more out of a bond, but even another $10 billion would potentially come at a crucial time to build out the rest of phase 1. Anyway, knock knock. Are you still there? I know I promised not to do 2 hours, so as I say, all good things must come to an end, including this video. As noted at the outset, this has been moved up in the queue due to extraordinary services, those of legislative calendar. I don't have a specific ask per se, but if this is something which piques your interest, feel free to reach out to your state elected officials and let them know how you feel on the subject. Do you think LA County Transit deserves a $3.3 billion bank check for transit? Do you think the High Speed Rail Authority should get $3.3 billion? Do you think no one should get the money? And that should just go back to the people as dividends? dividends, cap and invest? Sound off in the comments, and also to your elected officials. Anyway, as there are other videos in the work that hopefully will not take another 6 months to come out. So if those are something that you want to see, make sure you hit the like button, hit subscribe so you don't get left at the station when they arrive. Till next time, have a good one.